Okay, good morning, class.
Morning, ma'am.
Okay, how's your morning so far?
Great, ma'am.
We're
All right,
fine.
Ma'am.
Morning, ma'am.
all right, that's good to hear. So, before we begin, let me introduce myself. My name is Jessica May Gonzales, your teacher for today. So, next slide po. So, before we continue, let us start our day with a prayer to be led by Mr. Miranda. Mr. Miranda.
Okay, so let's take a moment to bow our heads and feel the presence of prayerfulness and effectiveness. Thank you, Lord, for this day that we have all gathered to this meeting, especially for the demonstration of Mom Jessica. Lead her throughout the lesson and for our song. We pray in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
All right, thank you, Mr. Miranda. So, Miss Secretary, Miss Apalas, are there any absence for today?
There's no absentees for today, ma'am.
All right, give yourselves a virtual round of applause for being present. Thank you for the response. Um, Next slide, please. So, here are the reminders for today's meeting. Mr. Tirao, kindly read the 3 reminders.
The first one is mute your microphones. Second is use the chat box or group chat. And the last is use the raise hand button to recite.
All right, thank you, Mr. Tirao. So, first is to always mute your microphones to avoid distractions and for us to have a smooth discussion. Unmute if you're called to recite. Next is to use the chat box or group chat provided to raise your concerns and to be acknowledged. Also, kindly immediately inform me if you are having problem with your connectivity. Next is to click the raise hand button if you want to recite, and lastly is to be attentive at all times. Are we clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you
Yes,
for the
yes,
response. So before I forget, as far as I can remember, I gave you an assignment last meeting, right?
yes, ma'am.
So please be mindful that the deadline is up until 10 p.m. today, and late assignments will have their deductions. Right. Next slide, Mr. Ferrer, please. So review of the previous lesson. So who can give me or what was our last topic all about, Mr. Ferrer? What was our last lesson?
It's all about analyzing signs, symbols, and data in technical drafting.
All right, very good. So what have you learned about the analyzing signs and symbols?
I've learned the different types of line symbols, or they called alphabet of lines, and their uses and purposes in a drawing.
All right, thank you very much. So, Mr. Akasho, can you give me examples of the alphabet of lines? Is Mr. Akasho available? Okay, Mr. Miranda, what are the examples of the alphabet of lines? Kindly unmute your microphone, please. Okay, Mr. Miranda is having a connection problem. Mr. Tirao, can you give at least 2 examples of the alphabet of lines or the signs and symbols in drafting?
Ma'am, Dimension line. Broken line.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Tirao. So, since you all seem to have understood our last topic, you all deserve to enjoy and play a game. Press heart if you're ready. So we can start. Kindly click the heart button. All right, thank you very much. So let us start. Next slide, please. So let us play. Decipher. Who wants to read the mechanics of the game? Mr. Ramasanta.
Okay, so decipher numerical codes with their corresponding letters will unravel significant terminologies. The students should press the raise hand button if they know the answer.
All right. Did you understand the mechanics, class?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
All right, thank you for the response. Next slide, please. That those are the codes that you will be needing to unravel the terminologies that we are going to play. So for the number one, what do you think is the answer for the number one? Any volunteers? Any volunteers? Miss Apales.
Mom, dimension.
All right, mention. Number two, any volunteers? What is the second terminology all about?
Ma'am, extension line.
All right, who's that? Thank you very much for the answer. Next, number three. Mr. Ambrosio, kindly answer number three. Hey, Mr. Raymond.
Center line, ma'am.
Right, thank you. Next, number four. Who wants to answer number four? Mr. Tirao.
Leader line, ma'am.
And
Leader
last,
line.
thank you, Mr. Tirao. And lastly, Miss Apales.
It's arrowhead.
All right, let us check if all of your answers are correct. All right, dimension, extension line, center line, leader line, arrowhead. Did you get the correct answers?
Yes, mom.
Right. So, kindly press the clap button for your achievements. So, what have you noticed about the terminologies within your answers? What have you noticed about the answers that were unraveled? Any other hands? Mr. Aquino.
Ma'am, I think, ma'am, it is connected with lines po.
Yes, it is about lines. Any other answers? All right, Mr. Tirao, again.
Yes, ma'am. Come again.
What have you noticed about the terminal that have unraveled within the answers of the game?
Ma'am, uh, I noticed the different types of lines, ma'am. Types and kinds of line.
All right, thank you very much. So, our topic for today is all about, next slide please, the parts and basic rules in dimensioning. Next slide po. So, these are the objectives that needs to be attained at the end of the discussion. Who wants to read? Mr. Akasho, kindly read the objectives.
Objectives: identify the parts and types of dimensions in technical drawing. Second is apply the general rules in dimensioning. Then lastly, value the importance of dimension in technical drawing.
All right, next slide please. So, those are the objectives. So I apologize for the noisy environment. So who wants to read dimensioning? Kindly raise your hand. I have here Mr. Romasanta.
Dimensioning, the process of adding size information to a drawing. It provides a clear and complete description of an object, gives the exact measurement of the width, depth, and height of an object.
So dimensionings can mostly be found and is usually useful in making house plans, blueprints, and floor plans. So why do you think is it important in making plans? Why do you think dimensioning is important in making plans? Who wants to answer? Mr. Ferrer, why is dimensioning important?
Because using the dimension, it will help us to know the size or the measurement of every line or form of an part of the drawing.
Thank you very much for your answer. Very well said. So, as we all know of, the main objective of dimensioning is to help the construction making easier by not requiring them to add, subtract, and estimate. Next slide, please. So, next is the dimension line. Kindly read the dimension line, Ms. Rocaberte. Guys, are you still listening?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Ma'am.
Yes,
Okay, who wants to read dimension line? Kindly press the raise hand button. Miss Apales.
Dimension line. It is a thin dark solid line terminated by an arrowhead showing the extended dimensions.
So, dimension line is a thin, dark, solid line terminated by an arrowhead showing the extended dimensions. So, dimension lines are usually a thin line broken in the middle and allow the placement of the dimension text or the numerical line. So it says here that it is a thin line broken in the middle to allow the placement of the numerical value of the object. So can you see the broken line, the middle of the uh, or in between the dimension lines? Can you see it, class?
yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Alright,
ma'am.
thank you very
Yes,
much.
ma'am.
Next slide. Bigyan mo ulit. So those are the examples of the dimension line. Next is the dimension text. Kindly read the dimension text. Mr. Fernandez.
Dimension text. Numerical text that indicates the exact measure of an object.
So, dimension text is a numerical text that indicate the exact measure of an object. So, these, when we say dimension text, as you can see in the picture or the exact example, those are the accurate measurements of an object or distance that helps the engineers, architects, and draftsmen to um, easily recognize and identify the measurements of the objects or the plan. So are we clear, class?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Right, thank you. Next slide. Next is the extension line. Who wants to read the extension line? I'm seeing Mr. Romasanta.
Extension line is a thin, dark, solid line extends from a point of the drawing to which dimensions refer.
So extension line is a thin, solid line that extends from a point of the drawing to which dimensions refer. So from the word itself, extension, which extends, it is the continuation or extension from the surface of the object that establishes the size of the dimension. So these lines, as you can see in the example, these lines do not touch the object or lines that object lines or visible lines and extend slightly part of the dimension line. Did you get it?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. So next is the center line. Next slide please for the center line. So let me read it to you. So center line is a thin, dark, solid line composed of alternate long and short dashes and used to represent axis symmetrical parts. Um, Simple lines are used to indicate the center of a symmetrical object. As simple as that. Next line. Next slide, please. Center mark. Kindly read center mark, Mr. Miranda.
Center mark, a symbol used to mark the center of a circle or an arc.
So center mark, a simple symbol used to mark the center of a circle or an arc. So center mark simply indicates the center radius. So when we say radius, this is the uh, half of the diameter of a circle or an arc. The center mark usually looks like a plus sign. Next slide, please. So next is the arrowhead. Kindly read the arrowhead. Any volunteers? Mr. Aquino.
Arrowhead. It indicates the extent of a dimension.
So arrowhead indicates the extent of the dimension. Arrowhead are usually placed at each end of a dimension line. We all know the appearance of the dimension line because we just discussed it, right? Are we clear with the dimension line?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Yes, ma'am.
ma'am.
So, an arrowhead is placed at the end of each dimension line, and its pointed end touches an outline or extension line. So, arrowheads should also be proportion. When we say proportion, it is appropriate and displeasing to the eyes, so that uh, it can be readable to the draftsman or the engineers. Next, so those are the parts of the dimension. Next slide, please. So there are two ways of dimensioning. First is the detailed dimension. Next is the overall dimension. Next. Detailed dimension. Who wants to read the detailed dimension? So let me read to you the detailed dimension. Detailed dimension only shows the size of the parts of the portion of the object. So do you get what detailed dimension is usually used based from the picture?
Yes, ma'am.
Right, thank
Yes,
you.
ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Next, please. Next is the overall dimension, total of the width, depth, height of the object. So, in simple words, the overall dimension is the overall total distance, depth, width, and length of the plan or object that is being planned or worked. Next slide, please. So, these are the general rules in dimensioning. First is to avoid placing dimensions on the inside part of the view to avoid messy plans and blueprints. Number two is to always place the dimensions where the characteristic shape is shown in the most descriptive view for us to easily identify the details of the dimension. Third is if the same value is repeated many times, then use a general note for the feature. So avoid repeating notes to give space to the important uh, details. Next, four is to keep dimensions between views whenever possible. Do not place dimensions far from the object. Number five, extension lines may cross each other and over other lines on the part, but dimension lines should never be crossed because lines can cause confusion to the reader. So before I ask you some questions, can someone enumerate the parts of the dimensions that we have discussed? Mr. Tirao, kindly enumerate the parts of the dimensions. Alright, I think Mr. Tirao is having
Yes, ma'am.
work.
I'm back, ma'am.
Yes, thank you.
So the first one is dimension line. Second is dimension text. Third is extension line. Fourth is center line and center mark. Six is leader line. And last is arrowhead.
Alright, thank you for paying attention to the during the discussion. So let us give Mr. Tirao a virtual round of applause. Alright, thank you for the responses. Next slide, please. So, do you have any questions, clarifications that you want to ask?
None, ma'am.
All
None,
right,
ma'am.
have any questions, I will be the one who will be asking you. So, why do we need to study dimension, parts, and types? Any volunteers? Mr. Ferrer.
Ma'am, why do we need to study the dimension and parts and types in order for us to know their proper uses and purposes, ma'am?
Right, very well said. Thank you very much. Next, why is it important to know the rules in providing dimensions when doing plans? Mr. Aquino.
Why is it important to know the rules in providing dimensions when doing plans? For me, ma'am, knowing the rules in dimensioning is important because we are being knowledgeable in following the standards of dimensioning of plants and works.
Thank you for that answer, Mr. Aquino. And last question is, last one will be answered by Mr. Rainiel. So kindly read number 3 and answer.
Yes, ma'am. In what way can you apply the knowledge that you have acquired in our lives? So, I can apply the knowledge that I have learned in life by also following and knowing the details of the situations that we might and will encounter.
All right, thank you very much for the answers. Seems like you all have understood our discussion or topic for today. Um, Next slide, please. So let us have an activity. Next slide po. So kindly read the instructions. Miss Rocaberte.
Ma'am, make it right. These objects show bad practice of dimensioning, spot and identify the dimension that needs to be fixed.
Alright, so this object shows bad practice in dimensioning. So you have to spot and identify what are the bad practices that is shown in the picture. So I will be giving you um, 10 minutes to draw and identify what are the practices that needs to be fixed. You should place your answers in the chat box. So timer starts now. So guys, are you all done?
Yes, ma'am.
Ma'am.
Right.
Yes, ma'am.
Next slide, please. Next pa po. So we will be having our short quiz. So prepare yourselves. And these are the instructions. The first, next slide, please. So for the test one, label and identify the part of the dimension that is being shown. So you have to label and identify which parts of the dimension is being shown through the arrow in the picture. For the test 2, test 2 po. Next slide please. So, who wants to read the instruction for the test 2? Mr. Fernandez.
Go, ma'am.
Yes, kindly read the instruction for the test too.
Test 2. Instruction. Write smiley face if this statement is true based on a general rules in dimensioning and sad face if you disagree. Write your answers after each
Alright,
statement.
thank you, Mr. Fernandez, for your participation. So I will be giving you 20 minutes to answer and finish the tests that I have given you. So timer starts now. You have 20 minutes. So are you all done?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much. All right. Um, Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Mr. Ferrer.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Meron na ba? I cannot. It seems like I cannot see the flashing of the PowerPoint presentation in my screen. I think my screen is frozen. Has frozen. So
Ma'am, for the
you, so for the assignment, kindly make an advanced reading about or the orthographic views and drafting. I will be asking you questions on our next meeting. Did I make myself clear?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
All right, that
yes,
is
ma'am.
all for today. Thank you for your participation, and let's call it a day. Goodbye, class.
Goodbye,
Goodbye,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Bye, ma'am.
Thank you.
Bye, ma'am.